Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Menashe. Today's another AMA episode. That is Ask Me Anything. I love to answer your questions, and if you have a question you think is going to be of broad interest, send it in. I'll answer it live on the air. Send your questions to victor@victorjm.com. That's victor@victorjm.com. This question comes from Tracy in the Tri-Cities area in Washington State, and she asks, what does one do when a city imposes or interprets a code ruling incorrectly? I have a situation where a city official did not follow the standard guidelines for fire protection in a multifamily unit. Normally, if buildings are located 10 feet or further apart, standard attic venting can be applied, and we designed our duplexes accordingly. When we submitted our plans to the city, it would not let us install venting in the soffit because the homes were 10 feet from the property line and they did not know what the neighbors would do. Now, given that we were responsible for all the builds on the street and we could control this, and the setback requirements would not let a home be any closer than the current spacing, this was silly. We even went to the surrounding jurisdictions and they agreed that we should be allowed to vent the attics. We told the city in question about the stance of the other jurisdictions, but the building official was new and stubborn. So we installed attic fans, but given a litany of circumstances, the attic fans were not enough, and mold has formed on some of the roof sheathing due to condensation collecting. Now I've got mold mitigation to deal with. I've resolved this issue, but it's not the first time the city's caused problems. They did not meet the statutory timelines for a subdivision approval, which they actually admitted to, and I let it go. Even though they lost staff, extended the normal building permit timeline from 3 weeks to 6 months, and it cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars in holding costs. What would you do in these circumstances? Well, Tracy, this is a great question, and I feel your pain. I have at times experienced similar situations. There are some instances where it's easier to hold city officials to account, and then others when it's more difficult. In this particular instance, because you're dealing with a fire code, I would ask for a ruling from the fire marshal, because everything related to fire code is in fact governed by the fire marshal. That may or may not be enough. I had a similar instance where a building inspector could not properly interpret which side of the building was the front and which was the side in the instance of a corner lot. The inspector interpreted the property as having two fronts and therefore imposed a front yard setback on two sides of the home. The result was there was no space actually to put the house and still meet the requested front yard setbacks. Yet the zoning department clearly lists the property as buildable, and there was previously a home on the property. The plans examiner was unrelenting, and we were unsuccessful in getting a timely escalation of the review process to their management. So we chose a pragmatic approach. We simply withdrew the building application and then resubmitted as a completely new application. We rolled the dice, hoping we could get a different plans examiner. Unfortunately, we did, and the drawings went through the process with no further hiccups. I'm definitely sympathetic to your line of reasoning when near a neighboring property. We had a similar situation where the ruling from the plans examiner also made no sense. It was another circumstance. In that case, we were building a 10-unit apartment building in Philadelphia. Our side yard was facing the backyard of a line of townhouses that were on the street around the corner. The rear yard setback for those neighboring properties meant there would never be a structure anywhere near our building. Nevertheless, because our building was built to the property line, we were not allowed to put windows on that side of the building. Even though there was never a circumstance where a future structure would be allowed to come within 15 feet of our building, we were still not allowed to have windows. In that case, we made a pragmatic decision not to fight it. Like your situation, interpretation made no sense to us, but we made the decision not to fight it. Each circumstance is somewhat different, and we look at each one on a case-by-case basis. Most cities do have an escalation path, but it can be sometimes difficult to get satisfaction with that. I find that sometimes engaging the services of a lawyer can cause city officials to take notice. When the city is put on notice that the city is not complying with their own regulations with a letter to the city attorney is probably going to follow up. And when they do follow up with the department, they will start at the top of the organization and work their way down. City lawyers always work with top officials and almost never talk to the most junior level staff in a department. It's a way of forcing an escalation without asking for an escalation. The job of the city attorney is to keep the city out of litigation. Now, I can't promise that this approach will get you the desired result, but it's an avenue to explore. You might want to consult with a lawyer who's respected by city officials and by the city attorney to determine whether this is a viable course of action. In the case of not meeting statutory timelines, I would absolutely recommend that you take the city to task and seek compensation from the city. In many cases, the legislation stipulates the penalties imposed on the city when they fail to meet the statutory timelines. It could be a reduction or elimination of impact fees, which puts money back in your pocket and can help offset the higher carrying costs. This is a situation where you want to get to know the lawyers who represent the city's largest builders. I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that you're not the first person to run into these types of issues. Chances are high these situations have been challenged before, and you're not blazing a new trail. But you got to be careful. It's difficult to challenge the city at the same time that you're asking for their permission or a zoning variance. So if you're going to challenge them, make sure that your design is truly compliant with the building code and the zoning code. I want to thank you, Tracy, for an awesome question. And for the listeners at home, have an awesome rest of your day. Go make some great things happen. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.